So they rescheduled Dorothy's event. So I drew my sadness away by studying the amazing style of Dorothy's artist, Jacknife. I love Jacknife's cute characters and a very clean and distinctive style, so today I'm going over the various colors, textures, and overall style in these various works to find what makes Jacknife's art stand out so much. And using this, I will try and create a drawing in Jacknife style. Starting with what draws me to Jacknife's illustrations, the eyes of Jacknife's characters are interesting. As though many characters have a generally cute appearance, they have eyes with a high lateral corner. The style of an eye is important in character design, as both the eyelid and pupil shape can be used to signify personality. This is why many anime-styled girl characters usually have a doe-eyed or downturned corner of the eye in combination with large pupils, because they symbolize innocence. Jacknife's characteristic eyes are cool because while the large pupil taking up most of the space is used for innocence, the upward turn of the corner contradicts this, since it is usually used for cool, mature, or confident characters, but the eyes as a whole still reads as cute. Jacknife's eyes also stand out due to the colors used. Both the eye shine and the red of the conjunctiva, or the inner pink of the bottom lid, are shown. Even without considering the color palette and overall look, I can tell at a glance that this NPC is probably drawn by Jacknife, simply because she too has that red in her eyes. Of course, these wide eyes are also present in male characters, the cool, upturned corner contrasting with the innocent look of Corroserum's fluffy hair. Speaking of hair, Jacknife's hair coloring is interesting. It is shown that even with essentially 3 values of color, light, dark, and the transition shade, volume can be implied. Something that also distinguishes Jacknife's style is the use of a variety of textures. There is the typical smooth gradient on the hair, as well as the harsh edges on clothing. But for mainly flowing materials, a texture of parallel lines are used, following the flow of motion. Some of these lines are probably made by a brush like this. Aside from the stripes, a few objects in the background also have a uniform dotted texture. Not only do they fill negative space and make the objects look more interesting, but they contrast with the smooth parts of the image, such as clothing, which by the looks of it is probably made with a half opacity hard brush. The dots remind me of the look of manga screen tones, but also of dithering in pixel art. While I don't have a screen tone brush, I did have a past foray into pixel art, and so an overly complicated process of using layer masks to replicate this using pixel art brushes. Moving on, Jacknife's color palette is simple and harmonious. While some parts of the image mainly use muted colors from the center of the color picker, varying tones of gray are used on most of the image. In this image, the warm and cool tones are mainly separated by this line, the grays on the right consisting of warmer grays with orange, yellow hues, and the left being cooler grays in the shadow, with more varied blue and green hues. The separation of both warm and cool tone grays are present in this image as well, mainly being warm tones with a few cool spots, again typically in shadow. This piece also shows pops of color not only in the greens and reds, but a brighter color lining the edges of harsh shadow, also present in other works. Jacknife's pieces also show how shifting hues from the left and right of the color picker can change how warm or cold they are perceived. While these grays on the left look more warm, and you might assume that the hue is yellow, both palettes here have a blue hue. Finally, I'd like to point out how negative space and the color white is used in Jacknife's work. While white is used for balance in the obvious yin-yang symbol here, white breaks this image into half while drawing the eyes to the figure hidden and blending in with the background. On the right, white is used to frame Mulberry and is also used in the silhouettes of the birds. On the left, the use of hair and draping is used to frame and imply 3D forms unseen in the negative space. Using this overall analysis, I then made this. But how exactly did I make it? Let's start the painting. First, I chose to draw this character Fiametta because her overall design allows me to use many of Jacknife's concepts. Not only is most of her clothing a variant of gray or black, but her facial proportions are already similar to Jacknife's works, but has such a different rendering style that you can clearly tell the difference between her original art style and Jacknife's art style. I wanted to give a ballerina feel to Fia's body positioning, but while sketching out the thumbnails, I realized that while she dual wields, her weapons are nowhere near the same size, so I switched to a more asymmetric pose. I particularly like this one in which she's pointing her large weapon straight up, but I realized that I had to offset it since if she really wanted to point it straight up, wouldn't the bullet fall down directly on her? The checkerboard pattern on her E2 reminds me of this cool shape called the cardioid, and I thought it would be a good way to fill up the negative space and frame the character. Once the rough sketch was done, I started on the line art. Besides having an affinity for names which are portmanteaus, me and Jacknife have something in common, using brushes with very little line variation. So I sped through the line art of the figure as fast as possible with a no-pressure hard brush. Obviously here I had trouble with the leg proportions, but I will fix that later in the process. Also, you can see how much I overestimated myself. Thinking I can draw her guns was a big mistake, because drawing mechanical things is something I have very little experience in. It requires a really good grasp on perspective. But one thing it did allow me to demonstrate about Jacknife's style is through the straps. While most of Jacknife's lines for the figures are flowing and smooth, when the straps such as these are drawn, they have an almost stiff quality to them, which I think contrasts a lot with the rest of the piece. 4 hours in, and with the line art done, now onto the coloring. For this piece, I noticed that Jacknife has a lot of grays in the shadow, so I started off with a dark gray using a soft brush in brown for an even darker shadow. Then I blocked out the forms of light using a lasso fill tool and softened these edges using a half opacity hard brush. I found that the colors I used were often too yellow in tone, so I used a soft brush with a light pink to balance out the overall skin tone. After putting a white highlight on her nose, I then started on the eyes, not forgetting the pink used for the lower lash line. For the hair, I was a bit confused because Fia actually has a two-tone hair color, so I struggled to find a way to show both her hair and the light coming from the top. But I settled on again using the soft brush and then blocking in the shadows of the hair. I think I overworked the hair. I liked it better when it was more simplified, so later on I covered up a lot of these strands. For the whites of her clothing, I followed Jacknife's warm-toned light grays, while keeping the cold blue-tone grays to be used for the shadow. There wasn't enough contrast, so I used curves to make the highlights pop. To render the clothing, I used the lasso fill, this time using a large soft brush to brighten parts of the shadow, and then again the half opacity no pressure hard brush to soften the edges. I used the same techniques for the rest of the image, even the guns. Speaking of weapons, I tried to make the guns shiny by again using contrast between the warm-toned highlights and the cold-toned grays, but don't look at her weapons too closely. In a vacuum, I think they look okay, but if you compare the gun details and proportions to the actual character illustrations, you would see just how many errors I drew. A bit more rendering, and now to add textures. I wanted to add more brightness to the image, so I used a layer with Glow Dodge to brighten up certain parts, and then used a stripe brush on the feathers following how they flow on the same layer. To finish it off, I then added the dot texture. First, I used a dithering brush to make a small dotted texture. Now to use it as a texture with layer masks. Layer masks are used to hide parts of the layer without directly erasing it. Add a layer mask, click on the mask itself, and then paint bucket transparency to hide the entire layer. Now use a brush of your choice and the color white to reveal the parts of the layer you hid. I wanted a smooth gradient on the checkerboard, so I used a soft brush to reveal the dotted texture. Make sure you test out the interpolation algorithms so that when you enlarge the texture with the transform tool or scale it up, the edges of the dots become more circular than square. Personally, I like the clear edges interpolation. The reason why this only shows on the black squares is because I used a clipping mask, so whatever is on the layer is constricted to the layer directly below it. And done! This is my drawing in Jacknife style, now with the self-critique or what not to do. Not gonna lie, this painting was really difficult for me. I shot myself in the foot overestimating myself, thinking I could draw weapons, and I definitely didn't use the white space effectively. If this was a gacha character, people would probably view the whole image, but I actually prefer it cropped, specifically because I could hide the bad composition. If I were to redraw it, it would actually look better if it was drawn in a more bird's eye view, or use smoke to balance out the space. I do like the use of textures though. I think the coolest thing is the cardioid. It really fills up the space. Anyways, thank you for all your suggestions for artists to study. Although this one was a bit hard for me, you know what they say, practice means perfect, so I'm gonna continue practicing with more art studies to come, and eventually get to drawing backgrounds. See ya!